Chapter 3 Catechism of a Revolution. When the round table is broken, every man must follow Galahad, or Modred. Middle things are gone. C.S. Lewis. What does this new religion, this new faith that came on the wings of revolution, hold and teach? How does it differ from the old? First, this new faith is of, by, and for this world alone. It refuses to recognize any higher moral order or moral authority. As for the next world, it will happily yield that to Christianity and traditional faiths, so long as they stay out of the public square and public schools. As for the old biblical stories of creation, Adam and Eve, the serpent in the garden, original sin, the expulsion from Eden, Moses on Mount Sinai, and the 10 Commandments being written in stone, and binding all men, believe all that if you wish, but it is never again to be taught as truth. For the truth, as discovered by Darwin and confirmed by science, is that our species and world are the remarkable results of eons of evolution. Science affirms that the human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces, declares the Second Humanist Manifesto, written in 1973. That picture on the wall in biology class of the apes walking on 4 legs, then on 2, then evolving into Homo erectus, that is how it happened. The new gospel has as its governing axioms, there is no God, there are no absolute values in the universe, the supernatural is superstition. All life begins here and ends here. Its object is human happiness in this, the only world we shall ever know. Each society establishes its own moral code for its own time, and each man and woman has a right to do the same. As happiness is life's end, and we are rational beings, we have a right to decide when the pain of living outweighs the pleasure of living, and to end this life, either by ourselves or with the assistance of family and doctors. In the moral realm, the first commandment is, all lifestyles are equal. Love, and its natural concomitant, sex, are healthy and good. All voluntary sexual relations are permissible, and all are morally equal. No one's business but one's own, and certainly not the business of the state to prohibit. This principle, all lifestyles are equal, is to be written into law, and those who refuse to respect the new laws are to be punished. To disrespect an alternative lifestyle marks one as bigoted. Discrimination against those who adopt an alternative lifestyle is a crime. Homophobia, not homosexuality, is evil that must be eradicated. Thou shalt not be judgmental, is the second commandment. But the revolution is not only judgmental, it is severe on those who violate its first commandment. How defend this apparent double standard? According to the Catechism of the Revolution, the old Christian moral code that condemned sex outside of marriage and held homosexuality to be unnatural and immoral was rooted in prejudice, biblical bigotry, religious dogma, and barbaric tradition. That repressive and cruel Christian code was an impediment to human fulfillment and happiness and responsible for the ruin of countless lives, especially those of gay men and women. The new moral code is based on enlightened reason and respect for all. When the state wrote the Christian moral code into law, it codified bigotry. But when we write our moral code into law, we advance the frontiers of freedom and protect the rights of persecuted minorities. A corollary to the new moral code that enshrines sexual freedom logically follows. As condoms and abortion are necessary to prevent the unwanted and undesirable consequences of free love, from herpes to HIV to pregnancy, these must be made available to anyone who is sexually active, down to the 5th grade if need be. Under the new catechism, the use of public schools to indoctrinate children in Judeo-Christian beliefs is strictly forbidden. But public schools can and should be used to indoctrinate children in a tolerance of all lifestyles, an appreciation of reproductive freedom, respect for all cultures, and the desirability of racial, ethnic, and religious diversity. In the new schools, the holy days of Easter week, commemorating the Passion, Crucifixion, and Resurrection of Christ, are out as holidays. Earth Day, where the children are taught to love, preserve, and protect Mother Earth, is our day of atonement and reflection, from which no child is exempt. Environmentalism, wrote the conservative scholar Robert Nisbet, is well on its way to being the 3rd great wave of redemptive struggle in Western history, the first being Christianity, the second modern socialism. The Cultural Revolution is not about creating a level playing field for all faiths. It is about a new moral hegemony. After all the Bibles, books, symbols, pictures, commandments, and holidays have been purged from the public schools, these schools shall be converted into learning centers of the new religion. Here's John Dunphy writing with refreshing candor in 1983 in The Humanist about the new role of America's public schools. The battle for humankind's future must be fought and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism, resplendent in its promise of a world in which the never-realized Christian idea of love thy neighbor will be finally achieved. The new secularism is no milk and water faith. In politics, the new faith is globalist and skeptical of patriotism. For an excessive love of country too often leads to suspicion of neighbors, and thence to war. The history of nations is a history of wars, and the new faith intends an end of nations. Support for the UN, foreign aid, treaties to ban landmines, abolish nuclear weapons, punish war crimes, and forgive the debts of poor nations are the marks of progressive men and women. Whenever a new supranational institution is formed, the World Trade Organization, the Kyoto Protocol to prevent global warming, the UN International Criminal Court, the revolution will support the transfer of authority and sovereignty from nations to the new institutions of global governance. Shelley once called poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world. In modern times, songwriters have replaced poets in the consciousness of the young, and in the 1960s, the Beatles were the most famous, with John Lennon the poet laureate to a generation. In his song Imagine, Lennon lays out in a few stanzas the heaven on earth that is envisioned in the post-Christian dispensation. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. A self-described instinctive socialist, Lenin went on to imagine a world of no possessions, where everyone shares everything. Yet, on his death, at 40, the world would learn that Lenin had coolly managed to acquire $275 million worth of possessions, making him one of the richest men on earth. And though the world of John Lennon's imagination, and that of fellow Beatle Paul McCartney and Bob Dylan, was utopian, that did not diminish its attraction for the young. For these songwriters offered a new faith to believe in, with its own beatific vision of life here on earth, to replace the Christian faith that had shriveled in their souls. As David Noebel, author of The Legacy of John Lennon, wrote, the poet-songwriter knew exactly what he was about. In a statement that stunned the America of the mid-1960s, Lennon predicted, Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and will be proven right. We're more popular than Jesus now. The cancer of human history. But a religion needs devils as well as angels, and much of what the new faith teaches stems from a hatred of what it views as a shameful, wicked, criminal past. To the revolution, Western history is a catalog of crimes, slavery, genocide, colonialism, imperialism, atrocities, massacres, committed by nations that profess to be Christian. The white race is the cancer of human history, wrote Susan Sontag, a birth mother of the revolution, in 1967. The white race, and it alone, eradicates autonomous civilizations wherever it spreads. America was founded on a genocide. This is a passionately racist country. The truth is that Mozart, Pascal, Boolean algebra, Shakespeare, parliamentary government, Baroque churches, Newton, the emancipation of women, Kant, Marx, and Balanchine ballets don't redeem what this particular civilization has wrought upon the world. Like Rubashov in Darkness at Noon, our elites have come to accept Sontag's indictment of their civilization and have volunteered pro bono to assist the prosecution in making its case. If many Americans look back on their history with disgust, who can blame them? For, as Mirren Magnet writes in The Dream and the Nightmare, campus after campus has jettisoned traditional Western civilization great books and great ideas courses as obsolete. An alternative canon, supposed to be adequate to the new reality, emerged. Paul Goodman, Norman O. Brown, Herbert Marcuse, Frantz Fanon, Michel Foucault, James Baldwin, Malcolm X. Later, even the lyrics of Bob Dylan shouldered aside Plato and Montaigne. The relevant message was Western society's oppressiveness, stifling the instinctual satisfactions for the privileged, and tyrannically exploiting the poor and non-white at home and in the Third World. What was novelist James Baldwin's view of his country at the end of his life? "There is not an American history," he wrote, "nor is there now a single American institution which is not a racist institution." In her text, Progressive Constitutionalism, Robin West adds, "The political history of the United States is in large measure a history of almost unthinkable brutality towards slaves, genocidal hatred of Native Americans, racist devaluation of non-whites and non-white cultures, sexual devaluation of women, etc." Deconstructionalist Jonathan Culler says that the Bible must be understood, not as poetry or narrative, but as a powerfully influential racist and sexist text. Such sentiments are no longer rarities, but more and more the rule in higher education in the United States. In 1990, Tulane announced a new program, Initiatives for the Race and Gender Enrichment of Tulane University. University President Eamon Kelly explained the urgency. "Racism and sexism are pervasive in America and are fundamentally present in all American institutions. We are all the progeny of a racist and sexist America." A recent New York State Regents report on curriculum reform underscores the need for a fresh look at American history. African Americans, Asian Americans, Puerto Ricans, Latinos, and Native Americans have all been victims of cultural oppression and stereotyping that has characterized institutions of the European American world for centuries. This is the message children receive in college, and even in high school. Europeans and Americans are guilty of genocide against the native peoples of this continent. Our ancestors transported millions of Africans in death ships to the New World, enslaved them to do the hard labor that our forefathers would not do, and maimed and killed millions. Europe's nations imposed racist regimes on peoples of color, especially in Africa, and robbed them of their wealth. Christianity coexists with a condoned slavery, imperialism, racism, and sexism for 400 years. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? Asked the old man in Eliot's Gerontion. We are used to hearing the founders charged with being racists, murderers of Indians, representatives of class interests, wrote Alan Bloom in The Closing of the American Mind. These slanders are weakening our convictions of the truth of our superiority of American principles and our heroes. Indeed they are, for that is their purpose. Before the bar of history, America and the West have been indicted on the Nuremberg charge of crimes against humanity, and all too often Western intellectuals, who should be conducting the defense of the greatest and most beneficent civilization in history, are aiding the prosecution or entering a plea of nolo contendere. Too many can only offer the stammering defense of the good Germans, but we did not know. In moving this indictment, the revolution has complementary goals: to deepen a sense of guilt, to morally disarm and paralyze the West, and to extract endless apologies and reparations until the wealth of the West is transferred to its accusers. It is moral extortion of epic proportions, the shakedown of the millennium. If the West permits its enemies to pull this off, we deserve to be robbed of our inheritance. Why are so many Western leaders unable to refute the accusations? Because in their hearts, Clinton, Jospin, and Schroeder believe the charges are true, and that the West is guilty. Why else would Mr. Clinton have traveled to Africa to apologize for slavery to the heirs of the tribal chiefs who captured and sold the slaves? Slavery existed even before Arkansas, and the West did not invent slavery. The West ended slavery. In the Catechism of the Revolution, why did the West perpetrate history's greatest horrors? Because Western nations believed that their civilization and culture were superior, and that they had the right to impose their rule on inferior civilizations, cultures, and peoples. This is the radix malorum, the root of all evil, the belief that one culture is superior to another, which leads to the murder of the other. Eradication of the idea of superior cultures and civilizations is thus a first order of business of the revolution. Equality is the first principle. Who sins against equality is extra ecclesiam, outside the church. In the new dispensation, no religion is superior, no culture is superior, no civilization is superior. All are equal. It is diversity, the representation in society of all creeds, colors, and cultures, and the multi-ethnic, multicultural nation that we should aspire to and prayerfully are headed for. Logically, it follows that any candidate who would rally a constituency on the idea that Western civilization and culture are superior, and Christianity is the one true faith, is a heretic and a menace. How crucial is this conviction to our new cultural establishment? In 1994, the culture war came to Lake County, Florida, when the school board voted 3-2 to require the children be taught that America's heritage and culture were superior to other foreign or historic cultures. Board Chair Pat Hart, a self-described patriot and a Christian, said the idea was adopted in response to Florida's multicultural education policy. "It is fine," said Mrs. Hart, "for students to learn about other nations and cultures, but they should be taught that America's is unquestionably superior." A stunned teachers' union called the proposal jingoistic. "People don't understand the purpose and point of this," Keith Mullins of People for Mainstream Values told the New York Times. Nonsense. The blazing controversy that ensued showed that people knew exactly what the purpose and point were. School board member Judy Pearson made it clear. "We need to reinforce that we should be teaching America first. Otherwise," said Miss Pearson, "young people, if they felt our land was inferior or equal to others, would have no motivation to go to war and defend our society." One dissenter charged the school board majority with undermining our school system. The Associated Press reported, "Some teachers and parents say what's really being taught is bigotry." The spokesman for the National School Boards Association, Jay Butler, warned that values in education is something we hear more about with the rise of the religious right wing. The local teachers union president, Gail Burry, accused the board of violating the First Amendment. The board's majority wants to start from a conclusion, that America is superior to all other nations, and then work backwards from it. That's not education. That's indoctrination. But isn't starting from the conclusion that America is simply equal to all other nations also indoctrination? At the heart of the dispute is Pilate's question, what is truth? To the revolution, Lake County was contradicting the truth, i.e., all cultures are equal, none is superior. By claiming that America's culture was superior, Mrs. Hart's board had committed heresy. The revolution could not permit open defiance of a core dogma to be taught as truth to children in Lake County. So it went to battle stations. In the fall election, in a huge turnout, all supporters of the America First policy were defeated. "The people turned out the extremists," said Mr. Mullins. The episode exposes the true character of our new dominant culture. About its core beliefs, it is deeply intolerant and will not abide challenge or contradiction. Anyone who would teach children that America's culture is superior is an extremist teaching a lie, who has no business in the public schools of the new America. As equality is its core principle, the Cultural Revolution teaches that the real heroes of history are not the conquerors, soldiers, and statesmen who built the Western nations and created the great empires, but those who advanced the higher cause, the equality of peoples. Thus, the end of segregation in the South and of apartheid in South Africa are triumphs greater than the defeat of communism. And Mandela and Gandhi are the true moral heroes of the 20th century. Thus, Martin Luther King stands tallest in the American pantheon, and any state that refuses to set aside a holiday to celebrate his birth is to be boycotted. As for George Washington, if his name is removed from schools, so be it. Was he not an owner of slaves? Did he not participate in America's most egregious violation of human equality? As equality is a first principle, one person, one vote democracy is the highest form of government and the only truly legitimate form. It alone may be imposed by force, as it was upon Germany and Japan, and should have been upon Iraq. Military intervention for national interests is selfish and ignoble, but moral intervention that sheds blood in the cause of democracy, as in Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans, nothing is more pure. By this standard, the revolution judges the morality of America's wars. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Indian Wars, and the Spanish-American War may have secured a continent at a tiny cost in lives, but these wars are forever sullied by the annexationist and chauvinist spirit of the America that fought them. And though Korea and Vietnam were fought to save small nations from murderous Asian communism, they were unwise or unjust wars. For we were allied with corrupt regimes and fought to keep those countries in our camp in a Cold War that never had the moral clarity of a war against fascism. President Nixon's support for General Pinochet's overthrow of the Castroite Salvador Allende in Chile was an outrage. So too was Ronald Reagan's assistance to the Nicaraguan Contras fighting to recapture their country from the pro-Soviet Sandinistas. As for Reagan's invasion of Grenada to rescue that tiny island from the Stalinist thugs who murdered its Marxist ruler, Maurice Bishop, that was American aggression. But Clinton's invasion of Haiti to restore to power the Marxist defrocked priest, Father Aristide, that was intervention on behalf of democracy and fully justified. And so long as it is a good war, the end justifies the means in the Catechism of the Revolution. That Mr. Lincoln made himself an absolute dictator, trampled on the Constitution, imprisoned dissidents without trial, and unleashed General Sherman and Sheridan to burn the South to ashes was fine. The eradication of slavery justified the means employed, even if fellow Americans suffered terribly. As for the good war, World War II, allying ourselves with mass murderer Stalin and firebombing cities like Nagasaki, killing scores of thousands of women and children in hours, were acceptable because our hearts were pure and our enemy was evil. Richard Nixon is denounced for the murder bombing of Hanoi to free our POWs, bombing that North Vietnam said killed 1,900 people over 13 days. Yet Harry Truman is forever a hero, even though he ordered the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing 140,000 civilians, and sent 2 million Russian prisoners of war back to be tortured and murdered by Stalin in Operation Keelhaul. For the Cultural Revolution, the enemy is always on the right, and the revolution does not forgive or forget. Compare the remorseless pursuit to his grave of General Pinochet, the dictator who crushed Castroism in Chile, with the expressions of sorrow at the deaths of Mao's partners in murder, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. Byron de la Beckwith, charged with assassinating NAACP leader Medgar Evers in Mississippi in 1963, is tried, retried, and tried a third time 30 years later, and dies in prison, as the revolution demands, even as it pleads for clemency for Leonard Peltier, who murdered 2 wounded FBI agents after a 1975 shootout on Pine Ridge Reservation. The latest cultural icon is Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is on death row for murdering a policeman in Philadelphia in 1981 by emptying his gun into the wounded officer, who lay bleeding. 100 academic historians have urged that Mumia be given a new trial and that the killing of the policeman be viewed in the light of history. As Peltier is an Indian and Mumia is black, they qualify as members of a victim class. But 2 dead FBI agents and a dead cop, 3 white males, do not. The equality the revolution preaches is a corruption of Jefferson's idea: all men are created equal. Jefferson meant that all were endowed by their Creator with the same right to life, liberty, and property, and all must be equal under the law. He rejected egalitarianism. As he wrote John Adams in 1813, "I agree with you that there is a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talent. Measured by virtues and talents, it is more true to say that no 2 men were ever created equal. What America is about is not equality of condition or equality of result, but freedom. So a natural aristocracy of ability, achievement, virtue, and excellence, from athletics to the arts to the academy, can rise to lead, inspire, and set an example for us all to follow and a mark for us all to aim at. Hierarchies are as natural as they are essential. Consider the American institutions of excellence, from Microsoft to the New York Yankees, from the U.S. Marine Corps to the Mayo Clinic. How many are run on a one-person, one-vote principle? As history demonstrates, all peoples, cultures, and civilizations are not equal. Some have achieved greatness often, others never. All lifestyles are not equal. All religions are not equal. All ideas are not equal. Indeed, what is true martyrdom, but the most eloquent and compelling of all testimonies, that all ideas are not equal. While all ideas have a right to be heard, none has an automatic right to be respected. The First Amendment requires that we tolerate the false as well as the true, the foolish as well as the wise. But nations and societies advance by separating the wheat from the chaff and discarding the chaff. The revolution's idea of equality is ideological, utopian, absurd, and ultimately ruinous. Only a society adrift would award the Black Berets of Rangers, who have volunteered to take the gravest risks and gone through the most arduous training, to every clerk, cook, and bottle washer in the army. Was it not Lord Acton who said that if democracy dies, it is always equality that kills it? This debased form of equality traces its paternity to the French, not American, Revolution, to 19th century socialists, not to 18th century American patriots. Indeed, as all men are endowed differently with gifts, talents, and virtues, the only way to achieve equality of result is tyranny, and that is not America. Those who endlessly revise scholastic aptitude tests because the results collide with their preconceptions, then give extra points to students based on ethnicity, then throw the tests out because they still do not yield the desired results, are hopeless ideologues whose false ideas about human nature will never survive their first collision with reality. The equality the revolution teaches may be found in the final results of the Caucasus race in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. After all the participants had run around in circles for half an hour, they asked, "But who has won?" And the dodo said, "Everybody has won, and all shall have prizes." Mere tolerance, said G.K. Chesterton, is the virtue of men who no longer believe in anything. But our new faith is tolerant only about what it considers inconsequential: sex, pornography, filthy language, boorish manners, slovenly dress, and obscene art. It has no tolerance for those who defy its secularist dogmas. In the new dispensation, you can make a movie depicting Jesus Christ as a wimp who lusts after Mary Magdalene, as in The Last Temptation of Christ, but suggest a link between heredity and intelligence, as Charles Murray did in The Bell Curve, and you will learn what it means to cross the revolution. A local druggist may sell condoms to 13-year-olds, but sell cigarettes to the same kids and you will be prosecuted for endangering their health and imperiling their morals. Books that proclaim that God is dead, or that St. Paul was a homosexual, or that celibacy is crippling, or that Pius VII was Hitler's pope, will attract warm reviews for boldness, creativity, and irreverence, but slip and use a racial slur, as Senator Byrd did, or a vulgarism about homosexuals, as Rep. Dick Armey famously did in his malapropism Barney Fag, and you will not escape the whipping post. In the 19th century, blasphemy was a crime in many states. Today, blasphemy, vulgarity, and obscenities are acceptable, even on prime time. But ethnic humor is hate speech that must be punished severely. We can save the Baptists, says Darwinist David Dennett, but not if it means tolerating the deliberate misinforming of children about the natural world. Dennett warns creationists, "You are free to preserve or create any religious creed you wish, so long as it does not become a public nuisance. Those who will not accommodate, who will not temper, who insist on keeping only the purest and wildest strains of their heritage alive, we shall be obliged, reluctantly, to cage or disarm." There is the militant spirit of the modernist orthodoxy. Hate crimes. Like any religion, the new dispensation has its own catalog of moral crimes. The most odious are hate crimes, assaults motivated by hatred of a victim's color, creed, national origin, or sexual orientation. Now, clearly, the murders of James Byrd and Matthew Shepard were cowardly and contemptible acts that merit the maximum punishment. But why are these two murders, of the 15,000 committed each year, made a cause of special denunciation by our political and cultural elites? After all, the killers were nobodies. In the case of Byrd, ex-cons high on drugs. In the case of Shepard, thugs, non-entities. True, the killing of Byrd, tied to a truck and dragged to his death, was particularly gruesome, but that did not qualify it as a hate crime. It was a hate crime because Byrd was black, and his killers chose him because he was black. Shepard was beaten unconscious and chained to a fence in a freezing countryside after he made sexual advances to one of two thugs, who then decided to rob and kill him. His murder was a hate crime because Shepard was homosexual and his killers were white heterosexuals, enraged that one of them had been propositioned. Had Shepard been murdered in the same brutal fashion by ex-lovers, his killing would not have qualified as a hate crime, nor would his death have gotten presidential notice. All of us have biases, so let the author concede his. Had the killers of Matthew Shepard chosen a 16-year-old girl rather than a 21-year-old gay man, her rape murder would have been to me an even greater evil. But the killers in both cases should suffer the same penalty. And if the killer of James Byrd had been black, or Byrd white, his dragging death would have been an equally vicious atrocity, justifying the same penalty. Why were these two cruel murders singled out by the president and the press? Because they fit the profile perfectly. In the Catechism of the Revolution, the murder of homosexuals because they are gay, and blacks because they are black, are the worst of crimes, worse even than the rape murder of a child. How do we know? Less than a year after Shepard's murder, 2 men in Arkansas were charged in the murder of 13-year-old Jesse Dirkising. Here are the details as reported by the Associated Press. According to police, Davis Carpenter Jr., 38, and Joshua Brown, 22, drugged and blindfolded Jesse Dirkising, gagged him with underwear, and strapped him to a mattress face down with duct tape and belts. Then the boy was repeatedly raped and sodomized with various objects before he suffocated because of the position he was in, investigators said. At the apartment, the police found handwritten instructions and a diagram of how to position the boy. Other notes described apparently unfulfilled fantasies of molesting other children. On the night of Jesse's death, Brown repeatedly raped the boy while Carpenter watched, police said. Brown took a break to eat a sandwich and noticed the boy had stopped breathing. Carpenter and Brown were lovers, and the former masturbated as Brown raped the boy. Yet this torture-rape-murder got almost no national press. Why? Because this was a sex crime, not a hate crime, and because to show homosexuals in acts of sadistic barbarism does not fit the villain-victim script of our cultural elite. To spotlight the brutality of Carpenter and Brown would have set back the cause. Writes media critic Brent Bozell, had Jesse Dirkising been shot inside his Arkansas school, he would have been an immediate national story. Had he been openly gay and his attackers heterosexual, the crime would have led all the networks. But no liberal media outlet would dare to be the first to tell a grisly murder story which has as its villains 2 gay men. When Brown's trial was held, the Washington Times, almost alone among national newspapers, reported the proceedings. The discrepancy in national coverage of the Shepard and Dirkising murders isn't just real, wrote Andrew Sullivan, a homosexual and columnist for the New Republic. It's staggering. Sullivan found 3,000 stories on Shepard's murder in a search of the Nexus database the first month after the killing, but only 46 stories on the slaying of Jesse Dirkising. Fox News was the only network to report on Brown's murder trial and conviction. The big media have been converted into a communications arm of the revolution. Soon after Byrd's dragging death, 6-year-old Jake Robel died the same horrible way. As his mother Christy went into a takeout sandwich shop in Independence, Missouri, Jake was left strapped in his seatbelt in the back of her Chevy Blazer. Christy left the keys in the ignition. Kim Davis, 34, just out of jail, watched her go into the sandwich shop and jumped into the driver's seat. Christy Robel ran to rescue her son, opening the back door to pull him out. Davis shoved the boy out, still tied to his seatbelt. Christy Robel screamed hysterically for him to stop. Davis looked into the back seat, then into the rearview mirror, and sped off, dragging the boy 5 miles until stopped by motorists who spotted the boy's body being dragged along the highway. Why did this crime not get national attention? Because Jake Robel was white, and Davis is black. Hate crimes are the cultural elite's way of racially profiling white males. 10 days before Christmas of 2000, an atrocity more evil than what was done to Matthew Shepard or James Byrd was committed in Wichita. 5 young people were at a party when their home was invaded by brothers, ages 23 and 20. The 5 were put into a car and driven to an ATM machine, forced to withdraw their money, and taken onto a soccer field. The 2 women were forced to strip and were raped. Then the victims were forced to have sex with each other at gunpoint. All were made to kneel down. Each was shot in the head. The 3 young men and 1 woman died. The other woman, left for dead, ran bleeding and naked for a mile in the cold to find help, as the brothers drove back to ransack the house. Heather Muller, 25, was remembered for her singing voice. Aaron Sander had just returned from Mount St. Mary's College and Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, where he had decided to become a priest. Bradley Herman, 27, was Aaron's friend. Jason Beffert, 26, was a science teacher and a coach at Augusta High. He had planned to propose to the woman who survived, and had bought a ring and a book on how to go about it. Jason didn't get the chance to make the proposal or give her the ring. writes Frank Morris in The Wanderer. The Catholic Church in his hometown of Pratt wasn't big enough for his funeral, so it was moved to a larger Methodist church. In the minutes before he died, Jason Beffert was forced to watch as the woman he hoped to marry was raped. What Morris did not mention was that all the victims were white, and the killers black. Had the races been reversed, this would have been the hate crime of the decade. Yet this atrocity never made Brokaw, never made Rather, never made Jennings, never made page 1 of the national press. Why not? The story did not fit the politically correct national melodrama of black victimhood, white oppression, writes columnist and author David Horowitz. Mr. Horowitz seems to have a point. According to the 1999 Index of Leading Cultural Indicators, African Americans, though only 13% of our population, are responsible for 42% of all violent crimes and over half of the murders in the United States. The statistics on interracial crimes show an even more shocking pattern of prejudice. In 1990, Professor William Wilbanks of the Department of Criminal Justice at Florida International University was angered by a campaign to reduce black-on-black crime, as it seemed to treat assaults on whites as less worthy of condemnation. After an in-depth study of the 1987 Justice Department figures on victims of crime, Wilbanks discovered and reported the following. In 1987, white criminals chose black victims in 3% of violent crimes, while black criminals chose white victims 50% of the time. When the crime was rape, white criminals chose black women in 0% of their assaults, while black criminals chose white women in 28% of assaults. Of 83,000 cases of rape, Wilbanks could not find any in which the rapist was white and the victim was black. White criminals chose black victims in 2% of their robberies, but black criminals chose white victims in 73% of their robberies. When Professor Wilbanks' startling and depressing figures were first reported, there was no refutation, no challenge, no contradiction, simply silence. 10 years later, in 1999, The Washington Times published the findings of a study on interracial crime by the New Century Foundation, which relied on the 1994 Justice Department statistics. The NCF study supported Wilbanks' findings. Blacks had committed 90% of interracial violent crimes in 1994. As blacks were 12% of the population, these figures meant they were 50 times as likely to commit acts of interracial violence as whites. Blacks were 100 to 250 times more likely than whites to commit interracial gang rapes and gang assaults. Even in the hate crimes category, less than 1% of interracial crimes, blacks were twice as likely to be the assailant as the victim. The NCF study found Asian Americans to be the least violent group, committing violent crimes at only half the rate of white Americans. These figures must be deeply disheartening to tens of millions of decent African Americans. Yet they do expose a big lie, a central tenet of the Cultural Revolution. The malicious slander that America is a nation where black folks are constantly at risk from the majority. It is in America's minority communities that crime rates are highest. It is out of these communities that interracial crime comes. We solve nothing by self-deception. The same apparently holds true for England. Analyzing the figures for interracial crime buried in the Home Office's Statistics on Race and the Criminal Justice System, columnist John Woods found that of racially motivated crimes in 1995, 143,000 were committed against minorities and 238,000 against white people. Woods' conclusion: if the ethnic minorities comprise 6% of the population of the UK and are producing 238,000 assaults per year, and the white population, who comprise 94% of the population, are producing 143,000 racial assaults per year, it would appear that, on a per capita basis, the ethnic minorities are producing about 25 times more racial assaults than the white population. The New Century Fund is chaired by Jared Taylor, author of Paved with Good Intentions: The Failure of Race Relations in Contemporary America, a controversial figure in the debate on crime and race. But the NCF statistics are based on Justice Department numbers and track closely the findings of Wilbanks and Woods. They are also unchallenged and almost ignored. When the Washington Times asked Morgan Reynolds, director of the Criminal Justice Center at the National Center for Policy Analysis in Dallas, to comment on the NCF study of interracial crime, he shrugged. It's an issue that most white scholars ignore, because you can only get into trouble. It's no news to anybody who's pursued the differences of race and crime, but it's politically incorrect. Crime scholar James Q. Wilson volunteered that racial aspects of crime are too sensitive to be publicly discussed. But if that is true, why have hate crime statutes at all? A crime is a crime and should be punished, no matter the creed or color of the perpetrator. Justice should be colorblind, but this campaign to codify certain crimes as hate crimes has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with ideology. Our cultural elite wants Americans to see their country as it does, as a racist land in need of redemption, where white males are the most prevalent and dangerous of criminals. And the truth does not matter. If the rape murder of a 13-year-old boy, or the dragging death of a 6-year-old boy by a black ex-con, or a racist atrocity in Wichita does not fit, or worse, contradicts the script, bury the story. In the Catechism of the Revolution, the 30 murders of young men by the sadist John Wayne Gacy did not qualify as hate crimes. But had Gacy been beaten up outside a gay bar for propositioning a fraternity boy, that would have qualified. The murder of Dr. King would have qualified as a hate crime, as his killer, James Earl Ray, hated King as a black leader. But the murders of John F. Kennedy by a Castroite and Robert Kennedy by a Palestinian extremist would not. As the Mass, endless reenactments of the Last Supper, is a sacrament of Catholicism. Repeated recitations of the lurid details of hate crimes are a virtual sacrament in the new faith. The prototypical hate crime always has the same plot: hero, villain, and victim. Progressives standing up to white bigots on behalf of defenseless minorities. And the search for fresh hate crimes by media that have become the propaganda arm of the revolution never ceases. For each newly discovered hate crime reaffirms an infallible doctrine. Deep down, America is a homophobic, bigoted nation. Per Miss Sontag, the white race is the cancer of human history. But how did this new religion capture a Christian and conservative America of only yesterday? Where did it come from?